Did you know that the oldest recorded joke in history is about flatulence? It's from 1900 BCE in a place called Sumer, an area we now know as southern Iraq, and it goes like this. Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap. Now, if someone could explain that to me, that'd be great. But the point is, our lower bodily excretions, particularly the gassy kind, have been a source of humour and horror for as long as we've had records, and probably for as long as there's been humans. And there are times in history when the innocent bottom burp has caused the loss of life. And this video is about 4 of those times, well, 3 and another story. But stick around for the last one because in theory, it could happen to you. Herodotus is often called the father of history, if for no other reason than he's the first guy to write a book that was called The Histories, which actually means the stories, which is kind of apt, because he wasn't a historian as you'd think of now. We historians, we like to think of ourselves as critical and careful. We check what we've been told and we doubt everything. Well, he wasn't like that. He just wrote down whatever he was told, wherever he was told it, uncritically, and that meant you have to take everything he wrote with a huge bucket or even a truck of the finest sea salt. So, get ready to sprinkle your chips, that's fries to my American friends, with some of what Herodotus has to say in this story. It's certainly one of my favourites, that's after the old riding on dolphins thing. Wahibri or Apries as Herodotus knew him, was furious. He was filled with a sort of anger that's reserved for the god pharaohs and for Game of Thrones characters. Ever since he got his throne from his dad, Psamtik II in 489 BCE, he'd done a pretty good job. He'd expanded the empire, fended off an invasion attempt by Nebuchadnezzar II in 582 BCE, which was no mean feat, and beaten the king of Tyre, Lebanon as we now know it, in a sea battle. It was true that things remained tense in parts of his kingdom, but he never expected what happened next to happen to him. You see, in 570 BCE, Wahibri sent some soldiers out to help the king of Libya, Adikran. He got annoyed with all the Greeks settling on what they thought was their land. You see, the Greeks had conquered East Libya, then known as Syria, but they were being a bit cheeky with their expansion. At the head of these Egyptian soldiers was one of his most feared generals, Amasis. Amasis had been winning campaigns since Psamtik II was on the throne. But he didn't win this one. Something was not right. The soldiers were furious, but not with him. They felt like their pharaoh had sent them to lose, and they were on the verge of open rebellion. So, Wahibri asked Amasis to go to the soldiers and have a word. And that was pretty much the last he heard from him, apart from a rumour that on getting to the army's camp, one of them had put a helmet on Amasis' head and said he'd be a better pharaoh. Now, stood in front of him was the man who was supposed to go and capture Amasis and bring him back, another general, Petabemesis. When Petabemesis got back, he didn't have Amasis. Wahibri wanted to know why Amasis wasn't with him, of course. Well, Petabemesis may well have said, I did find Amasis, and I told him you'd ordered him to come back. The pharaoh probably asked, well, what did he say? Petabemesis replied, well, he kind of rose up on his horse, cocked one leg, ripped out a massive guff, told me to take it back to you and tell you that he'd be coming back with some of his friends. It was an obvious threat. That's why Wahibri was so very angry. Without another word, he had Petabemesis seized and his ears and nose cut off. That was a bad move. You see, the Egyptians, they liked Petabemesis quite a lot, almost as much as they did Amasis. So any Egyptians who were on the side of Wahibri rebelled immediately. In the end, the pharaoh had to get an army of foreigners together to fight his own Egyptian army. He was defeated, and Amasis became Amasis II, ruling Egypt for 44 years. If only Wahibri had been able to control his temper in the face of second-hand flatulence. The moral here is, never let a one-cheek squeak drive you to outrage. Like the first story, this story might not be entirely true. It turns out that ancient historians aren't the most reliable bunch, but even so, it tells us something about what it meant to squeeze the cheese back in the day. So, according to Jewish historian and all-round dodgy Roman brown-nosing turncoat Josephus, at some point at around 46 CE, the Roman governor of Judea, Venditus Comnenus, and yes, that is a very unfortunate name, had a problem. I say sometime around 46 CE because some say this all took place right after the death of King Herod Agrippa, which was 44 CE. But Comnenus, don't giggle, wasn't in charge of Judea until 46 CE. What Josephus actually says is that Comnenus took over after Harold popped his clogs, but he doesn't say how long after. Whatever year it was Passover, and Comnenus had apparently found himself in a pickle. He'd taken over a fairly peaceful kingdom. Herod and the previous governor, Tiberius Julius Alexander, had, if not got on, kept their disagreements to a minimum, and overall, things were quite good. The problem was, Comnenus didn't seem to be able to discipline his soldiers in the way his predecessor did. Usually, Passover would pass without incident. The locals would have their feast in the temple, and the Roman guards would stand on the temple roof keeping an eye on them to make sure they didn't use the gathering to plot. But this time, one of the soldiers decided that his dislike for the locals wasn't something he could keep to himself anymore. So I'll let Josephus explain.
One of the soldiers pulled back his garment and, cowering down after an indecent manner, turned his breech to the Jews, posed his privy members to the multitude, and spoke such words as you might expect at such a posture.
Some think
Spoke such words as you might expect
meant said some offensive things, but most historians seem to think that is possibly the best way of saying
he broke wind
that's ever been invented. We have no record of just how loudly the soldier expressed himself, but we do know it was loud enough for everyone in the temple to hear it. And it turns out that passing wind in the general direction of a large group of people indulging in one of their most holy festivals is a bad idea. Some of the crowd, mainly the elders, set off to find Comnenus and complain about the soldier. They wanted him gone, as in, from this mortal coil. But the younger men, they got angry straight away and started throwing rocks up at the soldiers. They thought the disrespect had come all the way from the top. The problem Comnenus had was that he couldn't convince them he had nothing to do with it. Things hadn't been going so great between him and the people of Judea, it seems, so they wouldn't listen to a word he had to say. So, instead of finding the flatulent foot soldier and making an example of him, he called for his entire army, full kitted out in their favourite "we're going to unalive the lot of you" armour, and had them descend on the temple. This caused panic, and the festival goers got up and ran, cramming themselves through the tiny passages that led out to the temple. In the panic, anyone who fell was trampled on, and according to Josephus, by the time the building was clear, as many as 20,000 people, though it was probably a lot fewer, had had their existences removed from them. What was supposed to be a day of joy and celebration became one of great sorrow. Comnenus ended up getting the sack, if you excuse the pun, not for this, but for letting a guerrilla warfare kick off between Judea and the Samaritans some years later. The moral here is, don't ruin someone else's party by sounding an unpanted pant horn at the guests. Anyone who can remember it will tell you the Cold War was pretty scary. That ever-present fear that some dodgy world leader might decide that this was the moment to fry everything. It was a bit like, now, but with more shoulder pads. While that unpleasantness raged on, Sweden wanted to keep right out of it. They declared themselves as neutral, and they didn't want to be drawn into the squabble and definitely weren't interested in a seat at the nuclear annihilation table. Being just over the Baltic Sea from the Soviet Union meant they'd get it right in the face if things did kick off, so you can't really blame them. Except it wasn't entirely true. Sweden had been passing a lot of intelligence back to NATO, and they kept an eye on its neighbour all the time. Of course, the Soviets probably knew this, so they in turn kept an eye on Sweden, even getting one of their submarines stuck on the Swedish coast in 1981. Apparently it was an accident. While the Cold War continued, Sweden kind of expected to find submarines in their waters from time to time, but not once it was over. So when in 1994 they were still detecting the telltale bacon-frying sound of air being released from Russian subs in their waters, Carl Bildt, Sweden's Prime Minister at the time, sent a letter to Russian President Boris Yeltsin asking what was going on. Boris hadn't a clue. He had no subs out there. I mean, he didn't even have the cash to send them out there anyway. And he wanted Russia to be friends with Sweden. He even signed a pact with NATO in 1997. Those were the days, eh? Anyway, things started to get very heated between the two countries. Sweden accused Russia of lying, and Russia accused Sweden of being out of their tiny minds. Things were tense between them. Then, in 1996, two scientists called Magnus Wahlberg and Håkan Westerberg had a hunch. Magnus and Håkan weren't acoustic engineers, they were marine biologists, and they knew that the local fishermen had told tales about the sea boiling around their fish nets. That's the fish nets they caught fishing, not stockings for a kinky weekend on the sea. Although, I never yuck anyone's yum, of course. You see, Håkan and Magnus knew that some bony fish have something called the swim bladder. It's a small sac that fills with air, and when the fish want to go to the surface, it lets the air out, and when they want to go down, they absorb some in. That takes much less energy than using the muscles to actually swim. One species of fish, the Baltic herring, is thought to film its swim bladder using gas given off from its stomach, and it definitely releases it through its backside. They basically control their depth with butt percussion. And what does the Baltic have a lot of? Well, Baltic herring. Magnus and Håkan found out that schools of them swimming together tend to dive at the same time, releasing a symphony of air biscuits to the surface all at once. Baltic herring skulls can be as big as 4 cubic kilometres. That's as many as 10,000 tiny bumholes dropping brown thunder at once. And that can sound a lot like a Russian submarine. Interestingly, some studies have suggested the fish use the same tailwind technology to communicate, which to be honest reminds me of someone I know, but anyway. On finding this out, the tensions went away, and thankfully the relationship between Russia and Sweden has been... Hang on, just checking my notes. Russia invaded where? And did what, prompting Sweden to join NATO in when? Damn it! The moral here is, whoever smelt it or heard it might not have dealt it, or something like that. CC, a 22-year-old man from China, arrived in hospital, presenting with acute abdominal pains. 6 hours earlier, CC had been at home, struggling with the hot weather. He was a healthy young man with no medical problems that he knew of, but he really couldn't stand how boiling hot it had become. In his fridge, he had a cool 1.5 litre, or 50 US fluid ounces, bottle of the type of cola that shares its brand name with a popular controlled amphetamine. So, in a desperate attempt to cool down, he chugged the entirety of it in less than 10 minutes. Soon after, he started to feel the pains in his stomach, like he badly needed to pass gas, but he couldn't get anything out. Eventually, the pain became so bad that he made his way to the emergency department of Beijing Chaoyang Hospital, where we definitely aren't now. As the medical staff examined him closer, they discovered that his heart rate was 130 beats per minute. His blood pressure had dropped and his breathing had slowed down. A CT scan revealed that the swelling in his abdomen had been caused by gas coming from cysts in his bowels, and that his liver was starved of blood. This was causing shock liver, also known as pneumatosis of the portal vein. That's from pneuma, meaning gas or air, and ptosis, meaning higher than normal. So there was higher than normal levels of gas in the portal vein that transports blood from the spleen, pancreas, gallbladder and gastrointestinal tract to the liver. This meant his liver wasn't getting any oxygen, and that can cause it to shut down. They gave him some anti-inflammatories to reduce the gas and protect the liver, but it was too late. Just 12 hours after taking his long drink, test shows inflated liver enzymes. That meant there was not much more they can do. CC's circulatory system started to shut down. They tried using adrenaline to keep his blood pressure up, but that didn't help either. 18 hours after arriving in hospital, CC passed on. Now, the paper about this has since been removed from the journal, but it concluded that it was caused by a combination of drinking all that soda in one go and not being able to force it out the normal way. But other scientists disagree. They think there had to be something else going on. Plenty of people, me included, have chucked 1.5 litres of cola in less than 10 minutes and done fine. More likely, they think, it triggered a problem he already had, but one that he didn't know about. And because the poor guy couldn't get rid of any of that gas with a good, healthy trouser cough, which was probably most likely another symptom, triggered or was part of something underlying that took him. The moral here is, if you have a lot of fizzy liquid, then soon after find you can't squeeze the cheese and you're getting really bloated, it might just be worth seeking out a health professional. Alternatively, the moral is, a good guff can save your life. Thank you for watching this far. I hope you like this bit of fun. Please do pull my like finger and rip that subscribe button. And if you want the extra thrill of helping me to do what I do on this channel, it would be amazing if you consider being a member and supporting me, or even just a super thanks. I'll be back soon, but in the meantime, remember to stay gross, because gross is good.